an organization. I should introduce myself. I'm Harriet Stonehill, co-president, along with Sue Klein, co-president, and we are an organization whose mission is to provide information on various issues that affect women and girls in the United States and around the world. We direct our interest or participation in moving from the education to the action by participating in other action-based organizations. So we bring our energy here to learn about the issue, and then we continue it by joining other organizations that have an effect on that issue. I'm not going to introduce long introductions for each one because I want to use the time effectively to hear from three important journalists out in the field so we can garner what they have to share with us, and then we can open it up further. I will just do a little mission. The mission of a news organization is to record accurately the course of events, including patterns of deception and of duplicity, to provide the truth. This was the position that Cicero set forth in his book On Duties. The definition remains true today. In this age of post-truth, we find the present administration views journalists and media as the enemy of the people. It is our obligation as citizens to be especially alert as to how this media is viewed to keep our democratic form of government. We cannot ensure that this form of government will continue to serve all of its citizens unless its journalists and media are free to express their opinions and to seek truth. So that was our statement as co-presidents for the last newsletters, and I will use that platform. And I don't know who's going to speak first.
I think we start with Jody because print came first.
Okay.
Before there were broadcasters, there were girl reporters and then women reporters in print.
Okay.
All right. So I'll just introduce myself briefly, and I prepared a few remarks because otherwise I would forget what I was planning to say. My name is Jody Enda. I work at CNN. However, my background is in newspapers, and I still consider myself a print journalist in that I write for CNN's website. I'm not a TV journalist. I leave the broadcast to the other two. I write long-form stories for CNN's website, which means magazine-like stories, and I try to delve deeply into various political issues. So in terms of my background, I think you pretty much have it here. I've worked at Philadelphia Inquirer for most of my career, and night reader covering the White House, presidential elections, and Congress, as well as before that local and, by the way, the Pennsylvania state legislature, which at the time had the fewest number of women lawmakers of any state, fewest percentage, smallest percentage of any state, which was very tiny since it was a big state. And I also was president of the Journalism and Women's Symposium, JAWS, which is the largest women's news organization in the country. And JAWS fights for the empowerment of women in journalism and in the news. So the accurate representation of women in the news. So you might have questions about that later. In 1953, my friend Betsy Wade was fired from the New York Herald Tribune because she was pregnant. In 1980, another friend of mine was asked by the editor of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat why he should hire her given that she might someday have a baby. Thankfully, things have changed a lot for women in journalism in the decades since. When I had my baby in 2001, on my first day back from maternity leave, my editor asked me if I would like to go to Afghanistan, which at the time we were bombing. I politely declined. I've been in this business a long time, not quite as long enough to have stood with Betsy Wade and others when they sued the New York Times in the 1970s, but almost. I was the lucky beneficiary of their bravery. I stood on the shoulders of Betsy, of Eileen Shanahan, Lynn Povich, and many other women as I started my career the following decade. Still, in my first job in St. Louis, I was the youngest of just 5 women on the city desk. I had to convince every one of my male editors that I was not there to cover parades or other fluff, but to write about the same hard news stories, from government corruption and malfeasance to mob killings and trials, as my male counterparts. And I had to convince a significant number of people who I covered, from cops to politicians to policy advocates, that I was a real journalist who meant business, and I did mean business. Along the way, I encountered a fair amount of sexism, not as bad as that experienced by my predecessors, but an impediment nonetheless. There were countless male journalists who informed me that I got a job, usually one they wanted, only because I was a woman. There were flirtations from sources and public officials, such as the Pennsylvania legislator who thought it was okay to grab women's body parts in the crowded House chamber, or the House Speaker in Pennsylvania who agreed to grant me an interview, but only if I would come to his office at midnight. I accepted the challenge, and he backed down. Over the decades, those forms of blatant sexism have decreased, though they haven't disappeared entirely. As our numbers grew in newspaper newsrooms, as well as many other professions, and as men began to understand that certain behavior was simply wrong, even if they didn't fully grasp why, women have been able to take their rightful place running newspapers, interviewing presidents, and winning Pulitzer Prizes. My younger women colleagues are shocked to hear what it was like when I started my career, just as I was appalled to hear what it was like for Betsy Wade. So in 2017, we're equal, right? You guys are too smart for that. I would suggest that's more true in theory than in practice. So let's take a look at the numbers, some of which you have in this excellent report, which I know you were emailed. Thanks to my friend Sharon Rosenhaus, a former managing editor for the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, the American Society of Newspaper Editors began counting the number of women in newspaper newsrooms in its annual census in 1999. Kind of late, but it's better than nothing. In that year, women comprised 36.9% of newsroom employees in newspapers. In 2015, the last year for which numbers are available, our representation in newsrooms went up to 37.1%. The figure has never hit 38%. Within specific newsroom jobs, the numbers are similarly static. In 1999, women comprised 39.6% of newspaper reporters. In 2015, 37.9%. So we went down. What about editors? Well, in 1999, women held 33.8% of editing jobs. 16 years later, things have improved to 35.3%. So not much. Sadly, because newspapers had shed so many jobs in recent years, the actual numbers of both women and men with ink in their veins has plummeted. In 2000, 56,400 people worked in newspaper newsrooms. In 2015, that number had dropped to 32,875, a decrease of 42%. And it was pretty equal among men and women. Still, it's true that women play bigger roles in newspaper newsrooms than ever before, just, I would suggest, not in large enough numbers. No one questions anymore whether a woman has what it takes to run a big city newspaper. After all, even the venerable New York Times had a woman editor, albeit for an abbreviated period of time. A number of other large newspapers also have had women editors, but usually just one. According to the Women's Media Center, which every year issues this really excellent report, 3/4 of daily newspapers have had at least one woman in the top 3 editing jobs. So that's something. The newspapers of the future are doing better. During the time that newspapers were either folding or shrinking, new internet publications came on the scene. Slowly at first, and now at a faster clip, these upstarts, and in places like CNN and elsewhere, additions to legacy media, are hiring more and more journalists and greater percentages of women. In fact, online-only publications have just about reached gender parity, according to the Women's Media Center. Why does any of this matter? Why do we care? I would suggest it makes a great difference in terms of the news we receive. Women, like minorities, bring a different sensibility to newsrooms. We write about issues that our male counterparts often overlook and add things that they don't think about when we are covering the same issues. In my own career, that's included covering public housing, which nobody was covering when I went to St. Louis, homelessness, reproductive rights and pay equity, civil rights for minorities, and women's empowerment. Even when we write about issues that men are covering, women view them in a different light. And we interview more women along the way. Women who cover education, for instance, also write about sexual assault on college campuses. Women who write about crime also write about racial profiling. It's not that men never do these things, but women bring them to the fore. Women in much greater numbers focus on these issues. And I think it makes a huge difference. We can't cover the entire world if our journalists don't come from every walk of life, from every minority group, and from every gender. And just a word about JAWS, because I know you wanted us to talk about things that we've done to try to improve the numbers and power of women in journalism. JAWS was founded in the mid-1980s. I became involved in the mid-90s and was president in 2001, 2002. We try to mentor younger women. We try to battle discrimination when we know it exists by contacting the people in charge, by putting out statements, by signing on with other journalism organizations when there are problems, not only with women, but with other issues like, for instance, the White House cutting off access to women. But I think that one of the most powerful things we do is network. And the women that I mentioned in here, specifically Betsy Wade, Eileen Shanahan, who was at the New York Times, Lynn Povich, who was at Newsweek, Sharon Rosenhaus, all of those are women I met through JAWS. A lot of my women journalism friends and some of my most powerful women journalism friends I met through this organization. And every year we invite younger journalists, and we have scholarships for young journalists and college journalists to come to our annual convention, which is in the fall in different parts of the country. And we also bring them into our local chapters and try to help lift them up. So I think that that kind of networking is really important for women. And with that, I will look to my colleagues.
Let's hear from the three, and then we'll have questions and comments, okay? So jot down your questions, comments, and we'll just get the information, and then we can direct it to different people. Thank you.
I'm going to do the broadcast flip side on the numbers and then turn it over to Bonnie, who's got a really unique perspective from her years of hosting To the Contrary on how women approach the news and the differences between men and women on the issues. And I'm just going to try and keep this a little short and turn it over to her. But when I was thinking about what I was going to say today, my thoughts actually went to Nairobi, Kenya. And why, you might ask, would you be thinking about Africa? And that's because my first big overseas assignment, I was working for the Voice of America at the time, was in 1985. I was a kid and I was sent off to cover the International Conference on Women that was held in Nairobi. And you know, for a kid especially, it was awe-inspiring to be surrounded by all these delegates from all around the world, to see how some of us had moved ahead and some had been held back. And I think the biggest teaching moment of the whole conference came not in the big conference hall, but on the campus of the University of Nairobi, where every day, under this huge baobab tree, women would meet, they'd gather, they'd sit, they'd bring their lunch like we have, and they'd sit and talk about the big issues of the day. Well, I finally turned to a couple of the African women And I said, well, why, it's hot outside, why don't we go inside? Why are you outside under the baobab tree? And the answer I got from one Kenyan was, that's because here only men can sit under a tree and discuss important things. It was a very simple act, but in its own way, it was groundbreaking. In this country too, we've had women who chose to speak out and to talk about important things in a place once reserved for men. And among them is broadcast journalism. We too had pioneer women in broadcasting, the ones who dared break into once was, at the time, an all-boy club in radio and television. They were women like Pauline Fredericks, Nancy Dickerson, Barbara Walters, right behind them, the next generation. Leslie Stahl, Jane Pauley, Diane Sawyer, and many others. They were the change engine, the role models for my generation. When I went off to Penn State to study broadcasting, I was one of 2 women in the entire program. It was about 90% male. Today, women make up, I'd say, roughly half of all journalism students. And in many universities, they are the majority of the broadcast students. The problem is the job stats haven't quite caught up with the school stats. We've come a long way since the days of the, quote, girl reporter in broadcasting. We've had war correspondents, and we still do, like Liz Trotta, Kimberly Dozier, Cami McCormick, who's still working for CBS right here in the Washington Bureau. They put that whole notion of the girl reporter to rest a long time ago. These days, and these stats are from the Radio TV News Directors Association, women make up 44.2% of the broadcast news workforce. That's not bad. Not bad at all, until you dig a little deeper and you find that most of these women are working in small markets. At the network level, women are, well, here I'll quote the title of Liz Trotta's book, Fighting for Air. At ABC, NBC, and CBS, only about 25% of the stories that actually make it to air are reported by women. ABC actually has the worst record. Only 12% of its anchors, correspondents, and field reporters are women. It's better at CBS and NBC, they're at 32%. The winner, the highest percentage of women, and you may guess that this one is PBS. They're at 45%. Now, part of the problem here is that most of the on-air talent are hired by men. And men tend to, you guess it, hire other men. The RTNDA says about 1/3 of all TV news directors are women. For radio, it's even worse. Radio remains more of an old boys network. It's just 25%. 1/4 of the radio news directors are women. So there's still a big gap to close in broadcasting, a lot of work to do, especially in the upper ranks. But there are a few heartening trends, and Jody touched on some of these. There's less tolerance, it still happens, but there's less tolerance of sexual harassment of women in broadcasting. I give you the case of Bill O'Reilly. Still, you have to wonder if he would have been forced out if it hadn't been for advertisers for moral and financial reasons pulling their spots off the show. One other thing I have to mention, which has really caught my attention, and Jody and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, which I consider really heartening. TV news especially is no longer the home of just the young and the blonde. There's far more diversity today, though again, not enough. But what I really love is the fact that more women are still at it, still on air, well into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. And you didn't see that 10 years ago. These veteran correspondents, they are our wise women. They're enjoying long careers in an age of high-def TV. And to me, even though they are small in number, that's remarkable. You think of Leslie Stahl still reporting for 16 Minutes, Jane Pauley just getting the anchor chair on CBS Sunday Morning, Barbara Starr at CNN, Andrea Mitchell still going strong at NBC, Judy Woodruff, of course, at PBS. And that's a big change, that we have these wise women on the air. It's a very refreshing one. Hopefully in time there'll be more, as Jody pointed out, as each generation of women in broadcasting mentors the next. And for more on mentoring and what women think, I turn it over to Ms. Bonnie Harvey.
Thank you, lovely.
Very good, thank you. I am going to leave the facts and figures to these two wise women. I'm just going to be speaking anecdotally and kind of off the cuff about my own experience. To the Contrary launched in 1992, which was, as many of you will recall, the year of the woman in American politics, and the year that all the House members who are now either Senate members or even in Barbara Boxer's case retired from politics for the most part, marched from the House to the Senate to get the Senate Judiciary Committee to reopen the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings and allow actually Anita Hill to speak, because she was a witness who came up after that. The men, including Joe Biden, who was then chair of the Judiciary Committee, closed off the hearings and didn't want to let her testify at all. And that was also the year you talked about going to Kenya, which I guess was 85, right?
85.
Yeah, Carrie and I went to cover in 94 in Cairo the UN Conference on Population and Development, which I don't think they have anymore because overpopulation is a verboten word here and globally.
They do the women's conference.
They do it in New York. They do it in New York.
Yeah.
Every 5 years, I thought.
They have something every year.
But it's not like.
But it's not like it was.
No.
It's not the same thing. And actually, Jesse Helms, who long time ago, a Republican from North Carolina, chaired the Judiciary Committee. He's the one who, the Foreign Relations Committee cut off funding for all those conferences. So it was directly a result of Helms and other conservatives in Congress that they no longer have these fabulous women's conferences. I remember when Carrie, first of all, I mentioned population and development because it was almost like Beijing, which was the conference on women the next year. It was almost like population and development was a preview, actually was the conference on women, because it was all about, women, giving women access to birth control and reproductive rights, and then women won't have by choice usually 7 or 8 children, as they do or at least they used to in much of the developing world. Give them an education, give them a skill, and they want few kids, and that's it. And we went over to Morocco, for example. We had a grant from the Packard Foundation right after the Beijing conference to go around to where USAID money was going, and the conservatives at the time were arguing that it was going for abortion. It was not at all going for abortion. It was going for women's reproductive rights. And in fact, in Morocco, one of the clinics I went to, it was the only doctor for hundreds of miles around, and really it was more of a pediatric care service. It was exactly the opposite of what it was being portrayed as in the United States. And I raise all this to say that something that I don't think you will probably hear from anybody else, but one of the biggest problems women face moving forward today is that there is now a huge constituency, which there wasn't in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, of women who say, we're equal, we don't have a problem, we don't need any more rights. That didn't exist. And one of them, of course, is very visibly in the White House, Kellyanne Conway, who I wouldn't say got her start on our show 20 some odd years ago, but we were certainly among the first, and probably the first to use her regularly. And women like Kate O'Byrne, who just passed. I don't know if you read, but we launched her career in television. Heather Nauert, who has just been appointed State Department spokesperson. The coterie, the huge coalition of women who are now some of the Republicans in Congress, who are in the White House, did not exist when To the Contrary was launched. It was hard to find conservative women. And I think it was because after Roe, the religious right was taken completely by surprise in 1972 by the Roe decision. And it took them many, many, many years to organize to become as powerful and as wealthy and as well funded and as omnipresent as they have become in those years. And that more than anything to me that's what's putting the Roe decision on the line again, 40 some odd years after it was handed down. Why are we fighting over this issue? Why are we fighting over birth control, which in the beginning the so-called pro-life conservatives used to say, we're just interested in ending abortion because it's murder, we don't care about birth control. Now they're going after birth control. Poor women are not going to have access under changes to the Affordable Care Act that they had up until now to reproductive rights, and so and to birth control. I say all this in terms of the media. The media, I think, have not gone on the same trajectory as the country has politically. We are still making advances. And as you pointed out about Bill O'Reilly, I was interested to note that yesterday stories came out about Andrea Tantaros. The first woman he settled with in 2004 is now going back and suing for defamation because of information that came out. I still think this kind of thing is going on. I just hope some would-be perpetrators, because really, in a sense, I think it's a sickness. I mean, to the degree that O'Reilly was doing it, certainly. It's a mental, illness of some sort that allowed him to behave that way year after year after year. And the things that he said to these women and the things that he told them, I don't think a well-adjusted human being could say. So I think it will continue to go on for a while. I hope, at least for the moment, the perpetrators, if you will, have been scared back by the Bill O'Reilly case, but it'll be forgotten in a couple of years, and there'll be another one and another one, and women will have to continue to fight these battles. We have made a ton of progress in the media, in politics, in all kinds of power bases, on the corporate level. But I really do think it's up to the young generation. You've really got to start fighting now, because so much of what women before you have fought for and won is at risk. And with that, questions?
Thank you. Or,
As a
comment. Make comments also.
I was struck by the article in the photograph in the Washington Post of the luncheon, I guess it was, that the White House sponsored. So there was the photograph with a caption, but no story. So, I mean, whatever your politics, it's interesting. The story underneath it was about the some Chinese wanting to trademark the name Ivanka. And I just thought that was outrageous.
Are you talking about the photo when they were talking about women's health, and it was all men?
It was just saying that they
Yeah,
had that luncheon.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, that they, whatever your politics, that they would have that photo, and that there was a luncheon, and then the story is just about the Chinese trademark, some Chinese wanting to trademark Ivanka
Yeah.
Trump's name. I just, it was like a huge disconnect.
Well,
And even the Women's March, I thought, if I remember correctly, I didn't think it got the coverage it should have by the Washington Post. I think I saw an section or something.
I think they had a big picture on the front
They
page.
had a big
Did they?
picture on the
Yeah.
front page, yeah.
Maybe it was,
Just showing the huge
maybe
crowds.
it was the day before or something, but I remember thinking that it wasn't adequately covered.
As far as that photo goes, I saw it online that day, and I sent an email to the group of editors
Uh-huh.
at CNN, look at this picture, this is what they were talking about, and they did assign a story, and we had a story on the website that afternoon. So that shows a little bit of the power of a woman looking at it and saying,
Yeah.
oh, wait a minute, something's wrong with this picture, so let's write about it. And I'm happy to say that they stepped up and
Yeah.
immediately did it.
I was a little disappointed that the lead on to replace the Gwen Eiffel program is being done by Coster from the Washington Post, who's a good reporter, but I was hoping it would stay in women's hands and their perspective on it, and yet they didn't do that. So things happen even now that change the balance of the way we're going to hear things.
And then again, when Charlie Osgood retired, they gave Sunday morning to Jane Pauley. So there's a
right.
trade-off, you know?
Yeah.
There's a
Well,
trade-off.
all right, please.
Yeah, I'm one of the first women graduates of Yale, and we finally got organized with the New Girls Network and have the Yale Women Network worldwide. I'm the DC chapter founder and head. And when we all got together and compared notes, we saw in every sector, in politics and government, it's like a ceiling of 20% at the highest levels. Politics, like U.S. Congress, 20% women, mayors, 20% women. And then the women in business was saying that's what we see at the executive suite. When you get to the C-suite, it's like there's a ceiling of some kind. And the women in academia are going, yeah, we have the same thing. Women heads of department. There's a cap there, it seems like, in every sector of about 20% at the highest level for women holding those positions. And we're trying to figure out exactly where is this coming from. And some of it seems to be at a certain level, women take themselves out because they've got families and the stress of trying to do the family and do the job, but that there's also still resistance to having women at the very highest level. So I'm just wondering, from your personal experience, what you see as the barriers for, like, take CNN for an example. Why aren't women more high up at CNN, really?
You got me on that one. I wasn't there when the current leadership took over, but I think in television in general, all the networks are run by men. In fact, I just read something
The
about
closest would be Deborah Furness, who was at NBC.
Right.
I was running the news department. I look with pride in one respect on my former employer, the Voice of America, and it may be because it is that hybrid of a government agency and a broadcaster. But at the moment, the 3 top jobs at VOA are all filled by women. And the news director's one, so there's 4. But then again, there's not as much of an old boy network there because they have the government hiring rules helping them out along the way. I worked at WTOP, and it was an all-male bastion in the upper level.
I think Paula really hit on something earlier when she said the people who are doing the hiring are mostly men, and men hire.
Men hire men. They hire what they know.
People hire, exactly.
They hire a clone of
who they know.
themselves.
People hire people who are like them. And as long as men are doing the hiring, particularly for the upper level jobs, they will continue to more frequently hire men. So we need women to break through to get into the positions where
Yeah,
they
and
hire
that's why
people.
you see it, not just in journalism, but you see it a lot in business. You know, what is the percentage of women sitting on corporate boards? Not that
Very
high.
Right.
What is the percentage of women serving in Congress?
And
Not-
women CEOs is tiny,
Yeah.
of Fortune 500.
Yep. But is that upper level above the glass ceiling still so much of an old boy network that when there's an opening, they bring in one of themselves?
Also, I think women need to do a better job of doing what men have done and hiring each other. I think that women get in these positions, and it's not that they don't want to hire women, but I feel like they need to be more fair, unlike men who hire other men. So women end up hiring men and women okay, that's fine. But I think we need to do a better job of promoting other women, mentoring other women so that women can compete on equal footing, working out childcare so that women don't take themselves out of the workforce, because
Right.
that's somewhat true. It's very true of women in newspapers because, we work really, really long hours and
Yeah.
at
We were
broadcast
fan
too.
broadcast.
Really long hours. So I was covering the White House when I had my baby. I was
I was
traveling.
with you too. We were sitting near
Right.
each other.
I was traveling the world. I would have to go out of town on the moment's notice. And after I had a baby, and particularly in the first few months of having a baby, I either couldn't or didn't want to be out of town that often and with no predictability. So I eventually, after doing that for about a year and a half, I switched to covering Congress because at least that's in Washington. So you could
Still
say
long
I
hours.
took myself out
Mhm.
in a certain way.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I had gotten to a certain point and felt I didn't want to be an editor, so okay. But yeah, and it is a problem because maybe if I had had childcare at my place of work,
Sure.
I wouldn't have had to do that.
And
And I think
outlets
it's
are notoriously
worse,
bad about that.
terrible. And I think it's just really difficult for women to move up the ranks and work the long hours that we have to work in the news business and others, without any kind of childcare and support.
That's why you find that so many women who make it to the top of reporting ranks are childless.
That's right.
Mhm.
They do not have
Yeah,
children.
the cover story, the news magazine this week is why Silicon Valley is not good to women. It's basically
It's the
those
same thing.
kind of things.
Yeah.
That's the cover
It's the
story.
same thing.
It's
Right on
raising
the
money,
top.
it's raising venture capital is
Right, and
very hard for women to raise.
then the
Yeah.
whole article was, which I pulled out and sent to my daughter, because she's there. And there is a big difference, she will tell me there's a big difference in what she gets and a comparable
I have a
person.
question.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
I think we were all struck by the underlying sexism in the Fox organization. And to me, that part of that is you see where there's a double standard, particularly in the broadcast journalism, where women have to be pretty or dress well, and if they get older, it's very hard unless they're super, super talented to have a career. Where men,
Get plastic surgery.
right, yeah, they ruin their faces. But and I think this is all part, the sexism that exists in journalism, and it exists in academia, it
Everywhere.
exists in Silicon Valley, I'm sure. Could you address the changes you were mentioning some of the women who have been more successful, and I think, well,
Yeah,
you
broadcasting-
continue to see pretty faces.
You
It's
are
not-
seeing more older women on the air, which is good, and you're seeing more diversity among the younger women.
and
You're
it's
seeing more
talent,
women
it's
of
not
color.
looks, yeah.
Definitely. You're seeing more women who maybe weren't beauty queens, didn't go into it and worried more about the color of their lipstick than the content of their reporting. And there was a lot of that for a while in broadcasting, and there still is in small markets to an extent, I would say. Did you say that?
Well,
There's less of that
yes,
now.
there's
Definitely
certainly
less
less
of
of it than there used to be, but I also think that broadcasting has retreated in importance in compared to the internet.
The other thing we have
I mean,
to keep in
the-
mind
the-
when we look at these older women, and by older I mean anybody over 40 in the eyes of broadcasting, who are still on TV and on the radio, is that the television and radio audience now skews older. The bulk of their audience is baby boomers. So it sort of makes sense in a way that they would keep these women on the air because they appeal to their peers.
They're
So
cheaper too.
is the internet, you're saying, might have leveled the playing field?
No,
Yes.
I think the internet has overtaken both print and broadcast and radio and TV in terms of importance and of And I think that there are many women's journalism startups online that have done extremely well and are using mainly female staff, like
that reminds me of
Jezebel,
Ariana.
like what the feminist.
Great
the-
example.
the-
Ariana
Great example of that
Huffington said
would be
that
WTOP, okay, where most of the management is male. Most of the reporters on the radio side are male, though you do hear, usually most hours, a female-male anchor team. The internet side, WTOP.com, I'd say at any given day, 85% female, including their news director.
Oh. So as I was saying, Ariana Huffington, I heard her speak about how because of her accent, she was not often invited to be interviewed, but since she has started her internet line, she has done remarkably well. The Huffington Post is very popular.
Well, and she's out of it too at this
Is
point.
she out of it now?
Yeah, she
Yeah.
sold
Yeah.
it a couple of years ago, so, but she is also, one reason why internet reporting jobs don't pay is because she set the tone by having everybody write for free for her. And, that has been, and as a result, it's still true, I believe, in most instances, that broadcast jobs and print jobs, to the extent there are really print jobs anymore, more like what you do, you're writing, but it's for an online, organization, that they don't pay as well as the broadcast
Are they
jobs.
unionized at all?
No, I don't know of any.
Which?
Well,
Online?
some of the broadcasts, but online, no.
No. I have a question for the interns here from Feminist Majority Foundation. What I would like to know is, where do you get your news? And do you seek out news sources that may not always jive with your opinions, with what your perspective?
I never watch the news, ever. If I do, it's online. I usually listen to a lot of podcasts, I listen to a lot of radio, I listen to a lot of NPR. And I have the news app on the iPhone. It gives you like notification updates, and I have like the Post, CNN, LA Times, New York Times, Slate, Vice, Vox. I have a pretty wide range of outlets on there, but I will admit I'm not gonna look something up on Fox. Like I'm like, why, for me, like I've looked at their reporting and I've watched it with my conservative grandparents, and I'm like, this is very skewed, like I'm not gonna seek this out for news because I feel like it's skewed. So
yeah, I would agree for the most part. I get most of my news from my phone. I have like the CNN and New York Times app, and so I'll get the notifications of the big stories, and then New York Times also does your daily briefing of the top stories, and I tend to skim that a lot because I often don't have time to go and seek out all of the stories that are happening.
What about Vice? What about Vice? I hear Vice all the time.
Vice is great. Vice and Vox is great, that are a little bit more geared towards younger audiences, I think. And I read a lot of that online when I have free time, but I never really watch anything.
well, I don't have a TV.
Yeah.
I don't have a TV and I don't have cable. So why would I, And I grew up not having one either. So it's like.
Yes, please.
I had a
Thank you, by the way. We always need a young perspective because we are so homogeneous with viewpoints and politics here.
I wanted to pick up on something Bonnie mentioned, which I think is critically important, and that is when you said many people in the constituencies here already think women have equality. And I started this project 2 years ago about reaching out to mayors because I saw they could be very effective for gender equality if they understood what could be done, and made it really simple. Here's 10 things mayors can do and we can get gender equality. And they really responded to that.
That's great.
But I was running into people who was saying, Eleanor, why are you wasting your time on that? You know, we already have equality. And it was women as well as men. And I'm wondering, where do people get that idea, and how do, I think we need some kind of a campaign, or how do we deal with that mindset? Because I think that may be our single biggest block. People think we're already there.
Well, and remember, Trump won not just white married women, which Republicans usually win, but white women.
Right.
53%.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not a political strategist. I honestly don't know what the answer to that is. If anybody has an answer, please let me know. But I think one thing that Ellie Smeal at the Feminist Majority Foundation has done incredibly well with is reaching out to young people and young feminists, and really almost single-handedly. I mean, the days of Rush Limbaugh and the feminazis are over. She took what had really turned into a word that a lot of young people didn't want to identify with because it had been so maligned by the right, back into a positive term that young women are now embracing, meaning feminist.
And I think one of the other issues there is when we present the statistics, we tend to present them in a particular way, like only 6% of women are directing major feature films, and in a very accusatory way. There's an amazing PSA out called, it's the Make It Fair Initiative. If you have not seen it, you should see it. You should see it right now. And they basically take the statistics, and there will be women in it that you recognize, of like, you know, last year only 89% of the plays on Broadway were made by men. That's not fair. You know, men only get to be naked in movies 25% of the time. That's not fair. It should be 100%. And when you see that, and you're looking at it from that direction, and it's flipping your perception of what those are, we're no longer these accusatory women who are saying, what are you doing for me to make these statistics correct? And it's something that Gina Davis is certainly doing in the major Hollywood studios, which is nice, but probably largely irrelevant, which is, if you think it's unconscious bias that are the reasons women aren't being hired and these stories aren't being told, I'm going to talk to you about those biases. And she's going into those studios and saying, you know, the statistics here are unbelievable. What are you doing about that? Oh, we don't do that at our studio. Yes, you do. Here it is. So that pretty soon that unconscious bias is just going to look stupid, and then they have that chance to change or not. So I think there are ways to present that story differently. We were very excited in Washington, D.C. when we had the first 2 women anchors on an evening news program, and I called my friend in HR and I'm like, congratulations, this is so exciting, this is groundbreaking, how'd you do it? Not as many men applied because the hours they were going to have to put in to report local news and the work they were going to have to do, and it had to be their own clothes, they were unwilling to do it, and they could get a job in another market, and ultimately the station was fine because they could pay those women less. That has nothing to do with those women who fully deserve that role and have done a kick-ass job. But that's another side of it, you know, and all of these numbers where it's like, great, those numbers are going up. I really want to know if they're being paid the same as their male colleague, and I'm willing to bet you that they are not. And as news, if we want to say that, or media becomes marginal in terms of where we're going, it's a business. And if women are willing to work longer hours for less money and do a great job at what they're doing, I'm not diminishing that at all, we haven't fixed anything. And I think it's that question again, and are we, you know, those are the numbers we're not pulling out. We're not comparing side to side I can't even name a male anchor because I never watch the news either because I'm never home at that hour, but there must be a male anchor. I'd be really interested.
Locally, you mean?
I don't care.
Leon Harris.
No, he just didn't. Leon Harris just get fired?
No, switch channels.
So, yeah, he's
Oh, okay, good. He got fired from the one. Whomever. I'd be really interested to know. It's going to be very interesting. I'm hoping at PBS that pay equity is even on Washington Week or PBS NewsHour, but it'll be interesting to find out. But I think that's another question, that we don't have those numbers consistently, and certainly the internet. And the flip side of the internet is it was going to level the playing field for women. And it's actually just opened up women to incredible levels of abuse and stalking, and all those women, many women who made early forays and were doing amazing work on the internet, have actually removed themselves from the internet because of the threat of personal danger. The police don't believe that someone can stalk you electronically. So they had nowhere to go for that kind of protection, and they've literally taken their voices out of that public discussion. And that's not good. It's not good.
So also, the problem with young people is we have tried as an organization, and we need to get young people to this table around it. The problem is we've even tried another, like, can we meet at 5 o'clock instead of noon? Because that restricts who can come for a 2-hour kind of break. And what we found, and I found it among other organizations that I work with, is that young people want to go home to take care of their babies, to give them a bath, to be with them. And so if you're a young mother, you don't want to go to a meeting at 5 o'clock, or you're going to take a course online or someplace to get bigger credentials, more necessary credentials for your own career. And so you can't really network. You don't, or you're going to go to a place where you can network your job capabilities for the next job. And that's a very hard thing to accept, I mean, in terms of getting new members, right? I mean, what is the biggest problem to get new members? And that's with every organization. You're finding more and more women's organizations are closing down. Wider Opportunities just closed my very first job. After 40 years, more and more organizations, because they cannot keep older members coming to meetings in the evening, and younger members just cannot afford that time, except when it affects their career.
Well, I think there's something else about younger women, and that is that younger women, many younger women, most younger women who I talk to, have not yet experienced what they consider discrimination.
Right.
Because they're still in lower level jobs. They don't know what they're getting paid compared to their counterparts, male counterparts. It's very hard to learn that information.
And the more educated they are, the more likely they are to make as much as the men.
Right.
The women with this case, it was a survey that came out years ago, but female PhDs getting their first job were making 98 cents on the dollar compared to men. So
And it's also
it's the discrimination sets in later, and also when women take themselves out of the workforce for children, for parental care, for whatever they're doing. It's really hard to get back in, and it's really hard to get back in. You'll never make the money you would have made if you stayed in.
That's right, or get to the same level that you would have.
And even when younger women do experience discrimination, it's not quite sinking. I just had dinner a couple of weeks ago in San Diego with a young woman executive at an online, very successful marketing company. And I told her about this Mayor's Guide to Gender Equality, and she was one of the people who said, well, why are you doing that? We already have equality. I said, really? So I talked with her a little bit. Turns out, first of all, she had been raped in college. And she was still dealing with the psychological trauma of that. And she had recently experienced discrimination with the men she was working with. There were 42 slots for an on-camera thing. She was given 7 that were all salesy, and all the substantive stuff went to the men. And I'm saying, you're telling me there's no discrimination, but look at your own experience. But it hadn't connected with her. It was like, for her it was my experience, not sexism in the society. So somehow we have to help people draw that link.
Holly?
I got distracted because I was going to ask you a question about intersectionality. The question I was going to say is, do you think there's somewhere where men are sitting at a group table saying, I didn't take the job going to Afghanistan because it wasn't a family supportive job? What?
I think there are more of them. I think there are more
than
of
saying
them.
that, especially dads with young kids, and I think that's just the changing nature of the millennial generation.
And more fathers are participating in childcare. More in families where the father earns less than the mother, the baby is born, the father takes off from work. I mean, this is happening. And I was, a year and a half ago, I was in Israel. I couldn't believe how many young men, because at that point they're both in the army together. I couldn't believe how many young men I saw pushing strollers and taking care of babies and walking with, small children at their side. We have yet to catch up to that, but I have a funny story on that note. I guess it was 15 or 20 years ago, whenever the .com bust happened. I was in Sausalito with my best friend, one of my best friends who lives in San Francisco, and we were having coffee, and I saw all these fathers with their strollers, and I said, "Oh, look, Tim, isn't this wonderful? You know, California's always ahead of everybody else. You know, all these fathers who are the, you know, primary caregivers." He said, "Bonnie, they're .com bust dads. That's what they are. They're not. It's not that we're so progressive in that way." So I thought that was very funny.
But you know, even the insurance companies, many years ago, TIAA did not let you, if you were in academia, that's the insurance that kind of covers it, till you were 25. And the reason they made that rule was that many women dropped out of the academia to have families and so on. So they never became insured as part of vesting it.
I have a question over here.
Yes, please.
What do the commentators think of Amy Goodman, who pretty much has her own news?
Yeah.
She's an on-camera news person, and she does a lot of her own statistics.
Yeah.
She's great.
Yeah. She's on public television.
Yeah, she's been around
No,
for
she's on
about
cable.
23, I
She's
think.
on. I'm sorry. She's on internet TV, and she's on Pacifica Radio.
Right. She's good.
So what can we do to support
Ah,
women in
thank
media
you.
generally?
Right.
And
How do we help?
Get on the boards of directors of major media organizations and tell them to change their ways. Most of these boards of directors for media organizations are overwhelmingly male. Some as high as 90-95%.
So who do we talk to?
You got to go to a headhunter,
male.
I guess, and
Headhunter?
and try to get on board. You know, offer yourself up as a
Board of directors type.
You're talking about
And keep tabs, if you're
That's a whole
concerned
career,
about
though,
women
in and of
and opportunities for them at your local broadcast stations. Now, I don't know if this would work for you with the networks, but it will with local stations. Keep in mind, they come up for licensing renewal. And if you get your comments written into that licensing renewal process, they're gonna take notice.
I'd like to mention one other thing about newspapers, op-ed pages. Op-ed pages are overwhelmingly male, and I've talked to people who run op-ed pages at major newspapers, and they tell me that, and women, that they do try very hard to get women to write op-eds, and obviously some women do write op-eds, but they're more often turned down by women. Why are they turned down? They have to get these op-eds written very quickly. Usually there's something that's based on the news. They have to do it that day or maybe the next day at most. Women are more likely to say they need more time to actually do some research and think about what they're writing about. And men, just like talking heads on TV, are more willing to just write off the cuff and think that they are the expert. Maybe they are the expert, but women don't necessarily think they're the expert. Even if they are, they want to take more time and do it. They're more busy. They've got children or parents to take care of, plus a job. And so women, we're more perfectionists. We want to, I'm that way too. I don't want to just whip off something off the top of my head without doing some research. And that's what women do. So we need to encourage more women to write op-eds. And to submit them if they're not asked, because that's the other thing. Just submit. And so that's one thing that you can do. It doesn't necessarily help women who are journalists, but it helps the representation of women.
More women's voices.
Get more women's voices. Right.
Good. And I'd like to see more women overall get encouraged to get into podcasting. It's huge.
Yes.
I mean, when I go running, those podcasts are on. If I can't sleep, my phone with a podcast are up against, little earbuds. Most of the podcasts I find I listen to, the hosts are men. And I'd like to see more women get into podcasting. There are younger women who are doing it, certainly. I would like to see more women of a certain age doing it. I would like to see more diversity in the women who are doing it. I would like
What
to
do you listen
see,
to?
oh God, I got a long list. I gotta tell you, my favorite's Alec Baldwin. I've got it, I think his podcast is fabulous. And I think women in broadcasting, and I know this goes for print, and I know Jody and Martin are gonna agree with me on this. We've gotta make it clear to these women, young women coming in, and I think they already know. I'm pretty sure they already know. We're multi-platform society now. You can't go in thinking, I'm just going to be on TV, or I'm just going to write for a newspaper. You've got to be ready to do it all. That is the ticket for a woman to be successful in this business today. You've got to be able to write for the internet, you've got to be able to take your own pictures, you've got to be able to maybe do public speaking or write your own broadcast copy. You've got to be able, to a degree, to do it all. That's just where journalism is today.
Yes, I'm feeling very arcane and aged. Does anybody here read a newspaper every day?
Yeah.
Oh,
Not everybody.
I mean, I also look, I haven't gotten into podcasts, but I think that's an excellent idea. There's a couple I'd like to listen to, I'm
I
sure.
like it. Does Feminist Majority do a podcast? If they don't, they should.
Yeah, they should.
I agree.
They
Yeah.
should.
Maybe we should do a podcast of what we do our meetings on.
Good idea.
Yeah. That's another thing I can do in retirement.
That's,
Can I just intersect my question, which is related to that? Loretta Bernadas, who's on our board and wasn't able to come today, but she usually does the videography here, has been editing many of our videotapes, and will do it to the one that Sherry's taking now, to put on public access TV, and also on YouTube. And so I was wondering, she's also encouraged us, she's on public access, she has access to the Maryland public access stations. She's encouraging us to get access to the DC public access. You know, how do we maximize that kind of idea? Is that worthwhile?
I wish I could answer you, I know nothing about public access, but, I mean, you should definitely set up, on your webpage, you have a website, right? You should post these on your website, you should do social media around them. I wouldn't even, at this point, bother with public access as much as I would getting more online exposure.
links to that YouTube.
And Facebook.
Facebook,
For your
YouTube,
Facebook Live.
Yeah, but when you post on Facebook, it has to be a clip, a short clip. If you post an hour and a half long video on Facebook, nobody's gonna watch it.
Well, that's true on almost anything online. So that's not just Facebook. The biggest problem with public access right now is it's largely funded with cable fees, which are all going down. So just as you would start going up on public access, they may lose all their funding. So, and the restrictions to doing a public access are odd. But yeah, I mean, if you put it up on YouTube, but then you have to let people know it's there because you're up against a lot of cat videos. So it's not just putting it up on the internet, you actually have to drive your audience to the internet.
Marketing.
They're not gonna find it on their own.
And your first 3 seconds have to
Right.
pull them in, no matter what it is. And it could be a cat first.
Sure.
Yeah,
A cat that's putting the tomcat in its place could be perfectly appropriate to your project, but, yeah, public access, and also it's very difficult, if you can get onto one, you're probably not gonna get on the next regional one, so that can be difficult too, it's a lot to work, the public access theory. But then I would actually say, how do you turn them into podcasts? Because the viewing time on YouTube is going down dramatically, but the listening time on podcasts is increasing. So how do you?
What you do is you get yourself, for your organization, you choose someone who's going to be a host, who's got a compelling voice, who can connect with an audience.
Yep.
And then you do a one-on-one interview with someone who's
Yep.
really attuned to a topic that you're interested in. Putting a panel on a podcast is a little
Not so
tricky.
interesting.
NPR does it brilliantly with their politics podcast that Tamara Keith
Mm-hmm.
is now emceeing, but that's tricky. It really is tricky, and you need, your typical people who have never done a podcast before who come in to be interviewed. When they do their politics podcast, it's with 3 of their correspondents
Right.
who are used to being on air.
And we had a great one at Temple Micah, chaired by Jody, with 3 other journalists, and it was dynamite.
Yeah.
It looked right, beautiful and important. And people went away saying, we gotta do something. And, so even locally, different organizations can do it, churches, synagogues, they need to get into this play also. We need to protect the people who are looking to tell us the truth.
You can also aggregate other people's work. I hate that story, but you know, it doesn't have to be this group creates all the podcasts. Why aren't you linking to Temple Micah or some other group that's covering these stories and you're pulling it together in one place or driving things to them? So it doesn't have to, you know, if you're knowing, oh, so-and-so's being interviewed by someone at whatever, can you get part of that clip and it goes into your site, you're crediting them accurately, hopefully they're going there for the entire piece. You don't necessarily have to do all the work yourself.
Hopefully you don't get
and that
fired for what they
aggregation,
said there.
well, that aggregation in this space is almost non-existent.
We aggregate
right,
news
digital-
stories, women's news
digital
stories,
is
but
key.
what a great idea to do it with the podcast. I think we'll start doing it right away.
All yours.
Yeah. Well, I have a podcast, I do a radio show once a week on Progressive Radio Network on the internet. So I just interviewed the head of Rachel's Network, a group of wealthy women who fund the environment.
That could be podcasted.
They have the recording, but how do I let more people know about it?
I don't know the mechanism. I know that there are several, Spotify, I know there are a couple of companies, internet companies, that get this stuff out there and gets it on iTunes and gets it whatever the...
How many people follow you on Facebook? Do you have a LinkedIn profile? And what are you doing to make it happen?
Facebook,
Because if
Twitter.
you're doing something, other people will find you to do it.
Yeah.
But if you're not doing anything, they can't even find you.
Yeah.
I mean, I can recommend several PR people in town that are very good at that, but they still have to
But
know
they're
that you have an
expensive,
audience
Yeah.
that's looking for it to happen, and there are just other. Well,
And with iTunes, what you have to do if you're going to start an iTunes channel, I've been researching this in the last few weeks. Actually, to start a real iTunes channel, we do our podcast of the show, and you're right. It's not as much. It's not the different material. We're going to start using our the rest of our interviews and do things like that. But to really start a channel for iTunes, you need to have at least 3 podcasts, and they've got to come out quickly together, because that's one of the things that iTunes is looking for, is the content that's recurring, and they want to see that. And then you can become one of their favorites, but they only keep you up as a favorite for a short amount of time, and then you go into wherever.
Last question.
You mentioned that there's hardly any unionization there, and of course I work for a labor union. My top 3 bosses are women in my union, and I'm thinking, why is it? Would it help if you were more unionized, do you think? And what do you do to try to achieve that?
Well, I think we were talking about the internet, so just to go back to newspapers, there are a lot of newspapers that are unionized. I worked for, every newspaper I worked for, in St. Louis, Denver, and Philadelphia, we were all part of the newspaper
You were all
guild.
part of the guild.
All part of the guild. So, and the Washington Post, a lot of newspapers in the north in particular.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, we're
Are
not
unionized.
like
In the south,
we're
not so
for
much.
the state, right?
Right. So, but, so internet sites that are part of newspapers do have unions, but, other
Yeah,
internet sites.
broadcasters, it varies. In this market, in the DC market, I think maybe a third of them are SAG-AFTRA.
Oh, I'm amazed.
This is a very good market for SAG-AFTRA.
And websites that are only.
But
like
Politico
or.
JOB is SAG-AFTRA. What's interesting, NPR is SAG-AFTRA.
Yes.
Okay? There are more than twice as many male voices on the air as female at NPR. Not part of their
And it's
contract.
run by a woman.
Not part of their contract.
No.
And that's their own figure. I wish I could remember what the
That doesn't
exact
mean
figure
women.
is.
The women hire women.
Right, yeah.
So, my sincerest thanks.
Yes, thank you.
It's very important, because basically, we need to have our public voices protected so they can speak the truth.
Right.
You cannot have a democracy in the true sense of a democracy, and is the ground thing, freedom of speech, and to talk out against injustice, and to stand up to the bullies in this, and to keep it going. So we really have to unite in some way to say you are protected, don't feel threatened, we are behind you. So each of us has to make a commitment in some way, a personal commitment or an organizational commitment, to make sure that our journalists in all media, all forms of media, are out there feeling that they can do their job without discrimination and with seeking the truth. My many thanks.
Thank you.
Any final statements?
I want to mention two organizations if you're looking for places to support. I mentioned one,
Yeah.
JAWS. The website is jaws.org.
Right.
You can contribute, and the money does go to programming and scholarships, most of it to scholarships. And for younger women just starting out in their careers and college students. And the second organization is the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is working particularly hard now to protect journalists not only in other countries, which had been the major focus, but also in this country.
Well, many thanks. This has been a wonderful opportunity.
And thank you very much for organizing it. And if any of you all are members or would really like a copy of our most recent newsletter, I have a few extras.